Dr. Richard Bedlack started the ALS program at Duke and now is the Stewart, Hughes, and Wendt Endowed Chair of ALS at Duke. He also leads the ALS Clinical Research Learning Institute, ALS Untangled, and the ALS Reversals Research Program. He has many ALS publication, grants, and awards. He lives in North Carolina with his wife, Shelly, and a mischievous black cat, and a closet full of eye-catching suits, as you can see. His title today is ALS Update, Signs of Progress, Reasons for Hope. In his talk, he will be reviewing what he considers the most exciting recent development in ALS care and research. Dr. Bedlack, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. You know, I do quite a bit of speaking, as some of you have mentioned. At each one of these talks, it brings challenges and it brings opportunities. So one of my challenges today, as you can probably hear, is I've been doing a lot of speaking for the last 4 days in a row. So my voice is a little raspy, so you may see me taking several drinks of water. The other challenge is that Jumana reached out and said, we want you to tell this crowd all the things that you're excited about in terms of clinical care and research, and you got 20 minutes to do it. I mean, 25 years ago, Jumana, that would have been easy, but there's so many exciting things going on. So I had to really think about what I wanted to tell you about today. There's also opportunities. I've gotten to meet some of the fantastic people living with ALS and their caregivers from this area. So thank you all for coming over and saying hello. I know I interacted with some of you in different ways before, so that was fantastic. And the other opportunity today, the other first really, I've never had the opportunity to match the tablecloths at an event. So this is pretty cool. All right, so I always like to start my talks off with my disclosures. I want you to know where some of my support comes from. I have research support from a company called Medicine Nova, and also from a group at Mass General Hospital called the Healy Center. I have support from my clinic from ALS United's North Carolina chapter, as well as the National ALS Association. And then I do consult for a number of different companies. And what I do for those companies primarily is I help them to design trials. I think that a lot of the trials that companies design are not patient-centric. They're way too restrictive. They're way too difficult for people living with ALS to complete. And so I try to be the voice of patients who tell me that they want certain design features in their trials. So here's my outline. I'm gonna break the talk into two main parts. My favorite recent clinical developments, and there's gonna be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of those, and then my favorite ongoing research. And there'll be sort of 3 sections to that. So let's talk about clinical developments. So I've been doing this for a long time, 25 years. And you know, I always ask my patients, what are you hopeful about? And my patients sometimes ask me, Doc, what are you hopeful about? And my answer's been the same since day one. I'm hopeful that we're gonna find a home run drug where most people with this disease can stop progressing and even recover their lost motor functions. And it turns out we have our first one, but it's not exactly what I thought it was gonna be. So this is a drug called Tofersen. Its brand name is Qalsody. It's a type of drug called an antisense oligonucleotide. So that type of drug, what it does is it binds to something called RNA. That's the step between gene and protein. And it's specifically good for diseases that are caused by a bad gene, where the purpose of that bad gene is to cause a bad protein. And there is at least one form of ALS like that. It's called mutant SOD1 ALS. So 1% of everybody with ALS has it because of a broken SOD1 gene that makes a broken SOD1 protein. That is the thing that kills motor neurons. And so the science behind this drug is we wanted to try to get rid of as much of that broken protein as we could. And lo and behold, we put it into a clinical trial. I would say it was the thing that we had the most hope about because we understood why this form of ALS was happening. And the results were kind of unimpressive. There wasn't a real obvious clinical benefit after 6 months of treatment with this drug compared to people who were treated with a placebo. But we did see something really interesting. There's this biomarker, this way of measuring ALS. It's called neurofilament light chain. This is a chemical that gets released from any kind of neuron that's sick. And in people with ALS, it tends to be very high. The higher it is, the faster that person is usually progressing. And so with Tofersen, for the first time, we saw a more than 50% drop in neurofilament light chain levels, suggesting that we were saving an enormous number of motor neurons with this drug. And so the people in the room had to make a tough decision, whether to approve this drug or send them back to the drawing table. And I'm happy to say they gave it the first accelerated approval in the history of ALS. It's the first time any drug, yeah, go ahead and clap. I think it's pretty cool. It's the first time any drug was approved based upon a biomarker. Now, they put a lot of faith in that biomarker, and guess what? Their faith has been recognized and rewarded, because as we have followed people on this drug with that form of ALS, more than half of them have stopped progressing. 25% are significantly stronger than they were 2 years ago, including people that couldn't walk and can now walk. It's pretty awesome. So here's another drug that I wanted to talk about that I would consider to be a home run for some people. This is called dextromethorphan and quinidine. Its brand name is Nuedexta. This is a pill, and it activates a receptor in the brain called the sigma-1 receptor. And it was FDA approved, 15 years ago now, for something called pseudobulbar affect. Have you all ever heard of pseudobulbar affect? Yeah, I see some hands. So this is where people with different kinds of brain diseases, including ALS, they lose control of their laughing and crying. And it tends to come out at unwanted times. It can be disabling in and of itself. And this drug works really well for that symptom. Those of us that have used it for a long time have occasionally noticed something else that it does. Every once in a while, when we put a patient on this drug for pseudobulbar affect, we see a dramatic improvement in their speech and their swallowing and their drooling. So I'll give you an example. I remember some years ago seeing a young lady who was a school teacher, and it was early in the course of her ALS, but she had pretty bad dysarthria as well as pseudobulbar affect, and she was going to go on disability from being a school teacher. I put her on this drug, and 4 days later she called me on the phone, and she said, "Doc, this is Mrs. So-and-so," and I said, "It can't be." Her voice had completely changed. It was almost back to normal. And so someone finally put this drug into clinical trials for bulbar function, not pseudobulbar affect, but for speaking, swallowing, and drooling. And in 2 different randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trials, there was a significant improvement in bulbar function. So here's the problem that we face. The FDA has not approved it for that indication. So if you want to try this drug, we have to write down that we're trying it for pseudobulbar affect. We can't write down that we're trying it to make your speech or your swallowing or your drooling better, because then insurance won't pay for it, and it's pretty expensive. Here's another thing that I'm excited about. So we've known, for almost my whole career, that exercise is good for people with ALS. But there are questions about specifically what is the best type of exercise? How much is the right amount of exercise? Is it possible to do too much exercise? So someone invented a type of exercise that's specifically for the breathing muscles. It's called respiratory strength training, or RST. And the way that you do this is with valves that you put in your mouth, and you either suck on these valves or you blow on them. There's 2 different types of exercises, inspiratory and expiratory. And so now these exercises have been put into clinical trials. And in 2 different clinical trials, these exercises improved measurements of breathing, something called the maximum expiratory pressure. They also improved cough strength. But here's the one that blows my mind. People who did these exercises, the deterioration in their bulbar function, the loss of speech, swallowing, and secretion control, it decreased by 50% when people did these exercises. So I would say this is another blockbuster therapy. And then we get to diet. Again, questions about this for my whole career. We've known for a long time that people with ALS who lose weight tend to progress faster. And there's one study out there that suggests that a very high calorie diet might slow the progression of ALS, but there have been a lot of questions about where should those calories come from? And last year we got a very surprising answer. So a team at Columbia looked in a large database where they captured a lot of information about lifestyle habits, including diet, and they found that the best diet was one with a high glycemic index and glycemic load. So glycemic index is a measure of how fast a food raises your blood sugar. So foods with a high glycemic index include carbohydrates. Glycemic load is a measure of how much blood sugar is in what you're eating. So high sugar foods, like candy bars and ice cream, have a high glycemic load. So it turns out the best type of calorie is not what we expected. It's a calorie from sugar. So enjoy. So if sugar is actually good, is it possible that too tight a control of it might be bad? And some of you know that there's these classes of medicines now. One is called a GLP-1 agonist. One is called a DRP4 inhibitor. They modify the same enzyme, which is GLP-1. And this probably doesn't sound familiar, but if I say the names of these drugs, who's heard of Ozempic? Trulicity, Mounjaro, Januvia. These drugs have, they've soared in popularity, not just for the control of diabetes, but also for weight. So some of us have seen that when our patients with ALS go on these, their progression seems to just explode. And there have now been some of these cases published. And that team at Columbia, they looked in a large database, and sure enough, people who were on these types of medicines were progressing much faster than other people in the database with diabetes on different types of medicines. So, we want to do everything we can to promote, a good lifestyle. We want to give people exercises and the diet that we talked about. We also have to be careful that we don't have them on things like these medicines, which might be sabotaging all that we're trying to accomplish. So at Duke, we're looking for these. We have an algorithm when people come in that scans the chart, and if we see that they're on one of these, we get them off. All right, so let me now turn my attention to what's happening in research. So obviously, Tofersen, Qalsody, it's very exciting, but it's only for 1% of people with ALS. I firmly believe we're on the verge of our second home run therapy. It's another antisense oligonucleotide for another genetic subtype, which is called FUS. There was a paper that came out this summer that suggested the same thing, that this drug is stopping and in some cases dramatically reversing the disease in people with that form of ALS. There's other forms of ALS that might be amenable to antisense oligonucleotides, but clearly some are not. Like the most common genetic form of ALS is caused by something called a hexanucleotide repeat in a gene called C9orf ALS. We call that C9 ALS. So that's about 6% of everybody living with ALS. So 6 times more common than SOD1 or FUS. We've already tried a simple antisense in that form of ALS. It doesn't work. So we're gonna have to come up with something a little bit more complicated. Have you ever heard of gene editing? Gene editing is going to change the course of medicine for so many of the world's worst diseases, probably in the next 5 years. So gene editing means we have a strategy where we can actually take a gene and we can edit it and make it normal. So it's not about knocking down the gene's product. It's about making the gene normal. And this is not science fiction. This is actually happening right now for diseases outside the nervous system. Like I just heard a talk from a pediatrician from Children's Hospital of Pennsylvania, CHOP. So she said that these kids there sometimes get born and they have these obvious inborn errors of metabolism. There's something wrong. They're failing to thrive. They're not gaining weight. They might be having seizures because they can't tolerate something in the diet. So her team now can quickly diagnose what specifically is wrong genetically. They can go back to their lab. They can build a gene editing drug specific for that kid. They can get it FDA approved and IRB approved all within 6 months. get it into the kid, and cure them. So that's what gene editing is going to do. Now, it's lagging behind a little bit in diseases of the brain and spinal cord like ALS because we haven't figured out how to get gene editing into the central nervous system yet. But I'm confident we're going to solve that problem. And some of you might say, well, why does he keep talking about genetic ALS? I mean, that's rare, right? It's only 10 to 12%. Most people don't have genetic ALS. Well, it depends what you mean. So about 12% of people with ALS have what we call singleton genetic ALS, meaning they have one genetic abnormality that is the cause of their ALS. But I recently saw a talk by my colleague from the UK, Dr. Amal Al-Chalabi. He's convinced me that most ALS probably has a genetic component, but it's not going to be as simple as one broken gene. It's going to be a combination of genes that open the door to the disease and then exposures that let it in. And so all that we're learning about genetics, I think will very soon be applicable to everyone with ALS. That's pretty exciting. And some people say, well, gosh, it sounds so complicated, combinations of susceptibility genes and environmental exposures. How are we going to sort that out? Well, we got a pretty cool tool. And if this tool doesn't decide that humans are irrelevant and wipe us off the face of the earth, I think it's going to solve problems like this. It's called AI, artificial intelligence. This is what it's good at. It can look in databases where there's hundreds of thousands of people with a disease, and each person has 1 million data points. And it can say, how do all these data points fit together to determine why this person has the disease and that one doesn't? It's going to be able to find those patterns. So as we find more causes in the next 5 years, I'm confident you will see more home runs. At the same time, there's people like me that are studying outliers. What is an outlier? I'm fascinated by people who are doing extraordinarily well with this disease, and I've met several today, people that have had it for a long time, in some cases more than 10 years, like the lady in this picture right here. That's Andrea Pete. She's one of my patients. Hey, yes, give her a round of applause, amazing. So she's 11 years into her ALS and still doing marathons. That's very atypical. That's an outlier. There's even a group now of 64 people who seem to check all the boxes for either an ALS or a PLS diagnosis. They progress for a while, and then they recover all or most of their lost motor function. I call these the ALS reversals. So these are outliers. And I finally now have some clues as to why these are happening. So at Duke, I'm interested in the gut microbiome. Now you might ask, how in the world did you get interested in that? Well, 2 of my outliers, during the COVID pandemic, they got COVID, they got admitted to the hospital, they got pumped full of drugs, and they both got horrible diarrhea. And in the midst of that, their ALS progression exploded, where one died in a few months from respiratory failure, and the other one, who was walking for more than 10 years, became wheelchair bound and hasn't walked since. So it made me think, did we do something? Did we mess up their gut microbiome? So we did a study over the past few years where we looked at the gut microbiome, the composition of organisms in the stool of people with typically fast versus very slow progression. And it's quite different. So fast progressing patients, their gut microbiome is complicated. There's lots of different organisms. Doesn't seem to be one that predominates. These outliers, quite simple gut microbiomes. And there's one bug called P. vulgaris that really stands out. And so we said, that's interesting, but maybe it's just an association. We took the stool from those patients and we put it into our mouse model of ALS. And if we took the stool from the fast progressing patients, we could speed the disease up. And if we took the stool from the slow progressing patients, we could slow it right back down again. So it isn't just an association. There's something in there that's driving ALS progression. And so now people are starting to manipulate the microbiome as an ALS treatment. So over in China, there's some case reports of people having fecal transplants, people with ALS getting the stool from a person without ALS, and in some cases showing some improvements. So we're about to launch the first, I would say, informed fecal transplant trial at Duke. It's taken me a long time to get this off the ground, but there are many different people who've never collaborated before. working on this, and we'll probably have our first patient enrolled in the next 2 weeks. Thanks. So then we come to these ALS reversals. And I've been studying them for many years. I can't find a single thing that they all have in common. But a good percentage of them have a genetic abnormality. And what this genetic abnormality seems to do is lower the levels of a protein in their brain called insulin-like growth factor binding protein 7. Now, this abnormality is very rare in ethnicity-matched controls, people of the same race who have typically progressive ALS and are not reversing. So this is a surprise. And we've thought a lot about how could this explain reversal. One of the many things that this protein does is it gets in between growth factors and motor neurons, and it blocks the interaction. So with less of it, the interaction between those two things can be better. Motor neurons can be healthier, stronger, more resistant to ALS, almost like getting vaccinated. It doesn't mean you wouldn't get the problem, but if you got it, your body would be primed and ready to beat it. And so I've looked now in 4 different databases, and every time I look, IGF-BP7 levels are much higher in people with ALS than in healthy controls. So again, this supports the idea that this is really involved in ALS, and it's something new that no one has ever tried to go after before. So I also figured out a way to go after it. And knowing me, it's not going to be something simple. It's a nutritional supplement that bodybuilders use. It's called beta-hydroxymethylbutyrate. Abbreviation is HMB. So there's a trial in military veterans undergoing intensive combat training. They were given this drug, their fitness improved, and IGF-BP7 levels went down. So that's not a population with ALS. No one's ever tried this in people with ALS, but I'm about to try it probably early 2026. I said something earlier that was a mistake. I said there's not one single thing that all the reversals have in common. There actually is. There's one single thing that I think all the outliers have in common, and that's hope. So I've come to understand hope as something more than an emotion. It's more than a coping strategy. I actually think hope is a treatment. If you look across every disease where hope has been studied, people who have more of it are doing better medically. They have a lower symptom burden. They're less likely to be hospitalized. They live longer compared to people with less of it. And so I've thought long and hard about, where is hope coming from? I think it comes from different places. I think some people are just born hopeful. I think some people have a family that's their source of hope. But I think sometimes hope has to come from a person's doctor. And in the literature, mostly in the cancer literature, there's a ton about hope promoting and hope suppressing behaviors. And I've developed my own approach based on what I've learned running the ALS clinic for 25 years and reading that literature. And I call the approach stitching strength. So it starts with self-care. I think that too often healthcare professionals take the things that bring them joy and make them resilient, and they push them out of their lives because they're going to spend time, doing electronic medical records or fighting with insurance companies. The system pushes you in that direction to get rid of the things that bring you joy. We can't do that. So for me, fashion is one. Ever since I've been a kid, I've just noticed if I put on something really bright and colorful, it just lifts me up. And so I've got to keep that in my life. I think doctors should be very careful about the words that they choose. I think, especially when we're making a diagnosis, we don't want that person to walk away from that interaction thinking that their whole life is ALS. It isn't. ALS is one part of you now, but there's many other more important parts of you. We don't want that person walking away thinking they're going to live exactly 2 to 3 years. We told you there's outliers. There's some people who live 50 years with ALS. There's 64 people who've recovered from it. So the day that we diagnose someone, we have to be very careful about how we do that. And there's no way around having difficult conversations when you're an ALS doctor. It's part of your job. But there's a way to do it. I always tell my patients, hey, look, as long as you want there to be a plan A, we're going to have a plan A. Plan A is always to try something new, to try to slow, stop, or reverse your ALS. I don't know if we can do it, but I'm going to be your partner, and I'm going to keep trying to do that. But there comes times when the measurements say we have to have a plan B. So if this new thing doesn't work, I need you to help me tell me about whether you'd want to have a feeding tube. Let me explain what that is. Or tell me if you'd want to have non-invasive ventilation or invasive ventilation. These are conversations that have to be had, but they can be had in a certain way. I think it's important for us to get to know people with this disease. We don't ever want to look at you and say, you're just another example of ALS. No, you're a human being. Like, there's a lot of other parts to you that are amazing. And so that's part of why I do all these travels. I love spending time with people and getting to meet their families and see, what brings them joy. And then the last part of my approach, the newest part, is called the turbocharged living tool. So this came from a professor at the University of Virginia who had ALS, and I used to read his blog, Dr. James Plews-Ogans. And one day he wrote the most amazing thing. He said, I just got back from my ALS clinic, and as usual, it's great. I got to see this whole team of people. They gave me a lot of ideas for things that I could do. But I have to say, I can't help but feel like a failure because every single thing they measured was worse than the time before. And I've been trying so hard, but everything just keeps getting worse. And he said, what if clinics incorporated a measurement scale that didn't have to get worse, that measured other parts of a person independent of their motor neurons, like, for example, their sense of humor and their kindness and their compassion and their advocacy for others. It's kind of amazing when you roll out those questions. It takes only 5 minutes, but the person leaves the clinic with ALS is right-sized in their life. They've been reminded of all the other amazing parts that can get stronger in this disease until the day comes when we can make their motor neurons better. And so I believe so much in this approach that I was actually able to partner with a film company and make a movie about it. So let me see if I can figure out how to make that movie play out.
I've had to lose one at a time, a lot of the things I love. I can't hike. I can lose the mountain I used to hike, but I can't hike.
Before 2014, I think most people knew it better as Lou Gehrig's disease. But in 2014, the Ice Bucket Challenge happened. And all of a sudden, everybody knew it by its proper name, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS. As this disease progresses, you know what you want to do, but you can't do it anymore.
We were in New York in a play, and I had some Tic Tacs, and they kept falling out of my mouth. I literally couldn't keep them in.
And so it gradually takes away your ability to walk, to speak, to swallow, and eventually to breathe.
I remember looking at the band and saying, there's something wrong with me.
He lost his ability to walk and could not hold our children.
For every single case, it is a death sentence. Not a lot to be seemingly hopeful for, right? And yet, hope finds a way to muscle its way in.
I'm Dr. Rick Bedlack. I run the Duke ALS Program, and I've spent my life trying to figure out how to create options and hope.
Dr. Bedlack's positive energy rubbed off on me.
His clothing disarms people and instantly creates a bonded experience.
I've always found it's kind of like putting on a suit of armor, and I see that it rubs off on other people, so it's a win-win.
Your style is so badass, Rob.
Hope is going to be a huge part of what I do until we find a way to end this disease.
He wants to be one of the guys that help cure ALS.
This disease is not hopeless by any stretch. We're making incredible progress every day.
We shouldn't let a single label like ALS define us. We should be who we want to be.
The word was, you have ALS, but let me show you what the possibilities are.
I think if anybody's going to find a cure, it's going to be him.
Well, thanks. So hopefully I can bring that movie to you one of these days. I'd love to do a community screening in this area. That's what it's in right now, is a community screening stage. So it's making its way around the world. We've held about 20 of these. It's gotten into some fashion film festivals. And it's even won some awards, which is a big surprise. Not for the outfits, but for the message. So I wanted to end with this because very often when I give talks like this, I hear from people later, they say, well, that was all cool, but there's nothing in there that's specific to us. And I wanted to show you that there are things out there right now that every single person in this room can get involved with. So there are these things called natural history studies open. Every single person with ALS should be participating in at least one natural history study. This is where you contribute data. You contribute data about where you are in the course of it, how fast it's progressing, what other kinds of symptoms you have. You contribute genetic data, biomarker data. You answer questions about things you might have been exposed to. And by participating in things like this, we can plug all that information into artificial intelligence, and you can help us find the cause of more cases of ALS, which is what we need to get more home runs. So there is a study going on right now across the country, sponsored by the NIH. It's called All ALS. It's about 70 different clinics involved in that. I would say that's the one that's collecting the most data. So if your clinic has that one, seriously consider it. If your clinic's not doing that, there's two other places you can go to enroll in a study like that. One is a group called the ALS Therapy Development Institute, ALS TDI. They've got a website. Look on their website for something called the ARC, ALS Research Collaborative. They'll send people to you to draw your blood. And then there's the National ALS Registry as well. You can find those online. Trials. When people think about research, this is usually what they're thinking about. They want to try something. So those natural history studies, they're not treatment trials. They're to understand the disease better. And there are more trials than there have ever been. Unfortunately, most of the trials that are out there, they're very restrictive and they require a lot of travel. And as a result, 95% or more of people living with ALS are not going to be able to participate in those. So we have something now called expanded access programs. These were specifically designed for people that couldn't get into trials, to give them an opportunity to take the same drugs that are in trials. If you want to learn about the fascinating history of these, there's a movie called The Dallas Buyers Club. These actually started back in the days of HIV. But there's an expanded access program right now that anyone, anywhere in the United States can sign up for. It's called the Shinobi ALS Expanded Access Trial. And it's testing a drug called MN166, which is also known as ibutylast. I personally find that drug to be very exciting. I have a lot of my patients in this expanded access program. And if you're interested, the Wide Trial website has a place where you can go and sign up to be contacted. And then last but not least, there's this idea of self-experimentation. And that's what most of you came up to talk to me about today, the things that you were buying and trying. Look, if I had ALS and I couldn't find a trial or an expanded access program, you better believe I'd be on the internet trying to find things that I could buy and try. The problem is the internet is full of information, but there's no fact checkers. And so more and more I see websites opening up that are almost certainly going to cause way more harm than they are benefit. And so if you happen upon something that sounds amazing and somebody's asking you for $70,000 to $90,000 to go and get injected with something that's going to cure your ALS, be careful. I would encourage you to take a look at that link right now from the Canadian Broadcasting Company about a person in Canada named Dr. Goodenow and the harm that he was causing patients. But there's also a lot of good things available out there. And so, I run this program called ALS Untangled. We try to sort through the good and bad and help people living with the disease to make more informed decisions. And every few years, I publish a list of the top 8 to 10 products that I think are most promising for self-experimentation. And so here's the current list: acetyl L-carnitine, antiretrovirals, clenbuterol, L-serine, methylcobalamin, nicotinamide riboside, with pterostilbene, also known as basis, quinidine, dextromethorphan, and tamoxifen. So these are all products where there's at least one human trial, people with ALS, it showed benefits. None of these are obviously FDA approved, but I do think they're very promising. So I think I went a little over my time, but let me wrap it up by saying, in my opinion, there's never been a more exciting time in the history of ALS. We've got all these new clinical options which can dramatically slow progression and in some cases even restore lost function. I really believe we're on the cusp of understanding way more cases of ALS in terms of why they happen. And once we do that, we're going to find a lot more home runs. And in the meantime, we're starting to understand why some people are outliers. And I think we're going to be able to make that happen more often. And finally, there's lots of things out there. ALS research studies, you can get involved with things that you can buy and try. But always run any of these ideas by your own doctor. So thanks to all of you, especially people living with ALS and your caregivers. You know, you're the reason I get up every day and the reason I'm still fighting this fight. You inspire me. Thanks to all my collaborators. I couldn't do it without a whole bunch of people all around the world, many of whom volunteer their time to work with me, especially my Duke ALS care team. They're the foundation of everything else that I do. So thank you, and I guess I'll come back later and answer questions, right?
Thank you so much. This was wonderful.